The Bering Sea in February does not negotiate. At 68 degrees north latitude, 220 nautical miles southwest of St. Lawrence Island, the temperature at the surface is minus 28 degrees Celsius, with a sustained northwest wind at 22 knots that produces an effective temperature felt against exposed skin of approximately minus 47 degrees Celsius. The sea surface has not frozen. The wave action and the passage of ships through this corridor prevents ice formation at the surface. But spray that lands on the ship's topside surfaces freezes within seconds. The ship's forward railings have accumulated 4 centimeters of ice accumulation from spray that is adding topside weight and will require active removal every 3 hours to maintain stability margins. The sky at 3:19 a.m. in February at this latitude is fully dark. The sun will not rise for another 4 hours and 20 minutes. And when it does, it will cross the southern horizon at an elevation that produces light without warmth. USS Chafee makes 18 knots on a northwesterly heading, conducting a freedom of navigation transit through the Bering Sea approach corridor after completing a passage through the Pacific approach to the Aleutian chain. She is 4 hours from the approximate position where the Northern Fleet Intelligence Assessment places the submarine that the passive sonar team has been tracking intermittently for the past 90 minutes. The P-800 Oniks that fires at 3:19:47 a.m. is not from the submarine. The Oniks originates from a surface combatant, a Slava-class cruiser that has been operating without active radar for the past 6 hours, presenting as a passive contact at 48 miles bearing 330 degrees. The Slava has been stationary, or nearly so, consistent with maintenance or a position hold. At 3:19:31 a.m., its radar comes active in targeting mode. A 16-second warning that the Chafee's EW operator classifies immediately. At 3:19:47 a.m., the Oniks launches. The SM-6 intercept is generated within 12 seconds. It fires at 3:20:09 a.m. The SM-6 intercept is a direct hit at 3:20:31 a.m. The Oniks's airframe is rendered inoperable by the kinetic impact at 29 miles, fragmented into pieces none larger than 15 kilograms at the initial assessment. No warhead detonation, no secondary event. The debris field disperses across the Bering Sea at the intercept altitude. The Chafee is clear. This assessment is correct. The debris field does not reach the Chafee. What reaches the Chafee is the shockwave. The SM-6's direct hit intercept of a Mach 2.5 missile at 29 miles generates a detonation event from the impact energy. Not a nuclear event, not a large conventional warhead, but the kinetic detonation of approximately 660 kilograms of moving metal colliding at Mach 2.5. The kinetic energy release at the intercept point is substantial. The shockwave propagates outward from the intercept point at the speed of sound, attenuating with distance. At 29 miles, 46.7 kilometers, the shockwave arrives at the Chafee at 3:22:49 a.m., approximately 2 minutes and 18 seconds after the intercept, with an overpressure level of approximately 0.4 psi, well below the structural damage threshold for the hull plating and major frames. The shockwave is not below the damage threshold for the auxiliary steam system. The Chafee's auxiliary steam system is a network of piping that distributes low-pressure steam from the ship's auxiliary boilers to the ship's heating system for all interior spaces, the fresh water evaporators, the galley and laundry equipment, and the heating elements that prevent critical piping systems in the ship's forward spaces from freezing in Arctic operating conditions. In the Bering Sea in February, the auxiliary steam heating system is not an amenity. It is a survival system, the difference between interior temperatures that are cold but workable and interior temperatures that are cold enough to freeze the water in uninsulated piping. The main steam distribution header for the auxiliary system runs through the auxiliary machinery space adjacent to the main engine room. at approximately the 01 deck level, the lowest operating deck. The header is a 4-inch welded steel pipe running at 150 pounds per square inch and 180 degrees Celsius. Insulated with 2-inch fiberglass lagging covered by a stainless steel jacket. The insulation is maintained. The pipe is in good condition, and its design service life has not been exceeded. It was inspected 8 months ago at the last scheduled maintenance interval. The weld at the bracket support at frame 72. A structural support weld that holds the pipe's routing against the auxiliary machinery space overhead structure. Has a micro-defect in its heat-affected zone that was within tolerance at the last inspection. It is still within tolerance on the morning of February 3rd. The shockwave from the Oniks intercept arrives at 3:22:49 a.m. Its overpressure at the Chafee's position is 0.4 pounds per square inch, well below the level that causes structural or equipment damage in normal contexts. But 0.4 pounds per square inch applied instantaneously to a pipe joint with a micro-defect in its heat-affected zone does not behave like 0.4 pounds per square inch applied slowly. It behaves like an impact load on a fatigue crack. The micro-defect at the frame 72 bracket weld propagates to a full-thickness crack in 0.04 seconds. The crack is 6.3 centimeters long. The auxiliary steam header at 150 pounds per square inch now has a 6.3 centimeter crack in its weld. The steam exits the crack at 3:22:49 a.m. At 150 pounds per square inch and 180 degrees Celsius. Steam exiting a 6.3 centimeter crack does not exit quietly. It exits as a jet, a high-velocity, high-temperature, high-energy discharge that immediately fills the auxiliary machinery space with superheated steam vapor at a temperature and pressure that is immediately incapacitating to anyone in the space without protective equipment. Zero visibility, extreme heat, and an acoustic environment. The sound of high-pressure steam in a confined space is a continuous roar that overwhelms any other communication, making the space effectively inaccessible for normal operations. The auxiliary machinery space at 3:22:49 a.m. has 2 watchstanders in it. They are near the aft section of the space, performing a routine equipment check on the auxiliary boiler feed pump. The steam jet from the frame 72 crack opens between them and the aft access door, their exit route. They cannot reach the aft access door through the steam jet. They exit through the forward access door, the secondary access, at 3:22:57 a.m., 8 seconds after the crack opens. Both are uninjured. One has minor reddening on his right forearm from a brief steam contact while locating the forward door handle in zero visibility. He does not report the reddening until later. In DC Central, the auxiliary machinery space temperature alarm and the steam leak alarm activate simultaneously at 3:22:51 a.m. 2 seconds after the crack opens. The chief engineer reads both at 3:22:55 a.m. The picture is specific. Auxiliary steam header leak, auxiliary machinery space, at 150 pounds per square inch. The space is inaccessible until the steam is isolated. The isolation valve for the auxiliary steam header is at 2 locations. The main steam shutoff in the boiler room, which is aft of the auxiliary machinery space and accessible without passing through the steam-filled space, and the isolation valve at frame 65 in the forward section of the auxiliary machinery space, which is inside the steam-filled space and inaccessible. The boiler room shutoff is the only option. He calls the boiler room at 3:22:59 a.m. Secure the auxiliary steam system at the main shutoff. Leak in the main header at frame 72, auxiliary machinery space. Shut down now. The boiler room watch closes the main steam shutoff at 3:23:07 a.m. 8 seconds after the call. The steam supply to the cracked header is interrupted. The steam jet from the crack does not stop immediately. There is residual steam in the header. the pipe between the main shutoff and the crack point, approximately 23 meters of 4-inch pipe, which continues to discharge through the crack for approximately 45 seconds after the main shutoff closes. The steam jet diminishes as the header pressure drops, falling to a low pressure seep at 3:23:52 a.m. and ceasing entirely at 3:24:03 a.m. The auxiliary machinery space temperature alarm continues to show elevated, 68 degrees Celsius in a space that is normally 35 degrees. But the active steam discharge has stopped. The auxiliary steam system is now offline. The main shutoff is closed. No steam is flowing anywhere in the auxiliary steam distribution system. At minus 28 degrees Celsius outside, with the auxiliary heating system offline, the forward spaces of the ship are now losing heat. The rate of heat loss depends on the thermal mass of the forward hull structure, the interior insulation of the forward spaces, and the exterior temperature and wind speed. The chief engineer has this calculation. It is in the ship's cold weather operations manual, and he has been aware of it since the Chafee entered the Bering Sea operating area 4 days ago. At minus 28 degrees Celsius exterior and minus 47 degrees Celsius effective temperature with wind, an unheated forward hull space loses approximately 3.5 degrees Celsius per hour from normal operating temperature when the heating system is offline. The critical threshold, the point at which uninsulated piping in the forward spaces reaches freezing, is when the ambient interior temperature in the forward void spaces drops to 4 degrees Celsius. Below 4 degrees, water in any piping system running through those spaces will begin to freeze. Frozen pipes burst. Burst pipes in forward hull spaces produce flooding in spaces that are already cold, structurally stressed, and difficult to access. The forward void spaces are currently at approximately 12 degrees Celsius. The maintained temperature from the heating system that has just been shut down at 3.5 degrees per hour heat loss rate. The forward void spaces will reach 4 degrees Celsius in approximately 2.3 hours, 2 hours and 18 minutes. That is the clock. The clock has been running since 3:23 and 7 seconds a.m. when the steam was shut off. The chief engineer has two simultaneous problems: repair the steam pipe crack so the heating can be restored, and prevent the forward spaces from reaching their freezing threshold before the repair is complete. The repair is the primary problem. The crack in the auxiliary steam header weld at frame 72 is a 6.3 centimeter through thickness crack in a 150 psi line. The repair options at sea are limited. A pipe repair clamp, a bolted steel collar that bridges the cracked area and provides an external seal, is the correct solution. The Chafee's DC stores carry 6 repair clamps in sizes matching the ship's common pipe diameters. One of those 6 is a 4-inch clamp matching the auxiliary steam header. The clamp is a split collar design with 2 halves joined by bolts, lined with a high-temperature gasket material rated to 300 pounds per square inch and 260 degrees Celsius. But the clamp can only be applied once the auxiliary machinery space is enterable. The space is at 68 degrees Celsius with residual steam atmosphere and 0 visibility from condensing vapor. It is not enterable. At 3:24:15 a.m., the chief engineer activates the auxiliary machinery space ventilation. The fresh air intake opens. Minus 28 degrees Celsius air begins entering the space and mixing with the 68-degree residual steam atmosphere. The ventilation rate is approximately 400 cubic feet per minute. The space volume is approximately 800 cubic feet. At 400 cubic feet per minute fresh air intake, the space will achieve 1 air change in 2 minutes. The residual steam atmosphere will be substantially purged, and the temperature will drop toward a workable level. The mixing of minus 28 incoming air with 68-degree space air will produce a temperature in the 20 to 25 degree range after 1 air change. The space will not be comfortable at 20 degrees with Arctic ventilation and residual moisture. It will be enterable with thermal gear and SCBA The SCBA provides breathing protection against residual steam particulate, and the thermal gear provides insulation for working in a space being actively cooled by Arctic outside air. At 3:26:30 a.m., 3 minutes and 23 seconds after the steam shutoff, DC Central receives the temperature readout from the auxiliary machinery space, 31 degrees Celsius, declining. The residual steam atmosphere is substantially cleared. The chief engineer calls the repair team. Auxiliary machinery space is enterable. 2-person entry for steam header repair, full SCBA and cold weather gear. Frame 72 bracket weld, overhead run, 4-inch header. The crack is on the port side of the bracket at the upper weld. Clamp is in the DC locker, 4-inch steam clamp, orange label. You will need the stepladder from the aft locker. The header is at overhead height. Watch for ice formation on the deck from condensation. The incoming ventilation air is cold and will frost any wet surface. Grip the ladder rails, not the rungs, for footing. Move. The repair team, the chief engineer and the lead machinist's mate, enter the auxiliary machinery space at 3:27:14 a.m. The space is visibly changed from its normal state. Condensation on every cold surface. A light frost on the deck grating from the condensing steam meeting the incoming Arctic air. The pipe insulation jacket at frame 72 visible as a dark wet section where the steam has saturated the lagging. The crack itself is not visible from the entry point. It is on the port side of the bracket at the weld between the pipe and the bracket support, at approximately 2.2 meters above the deck level. The stepladder is staged. The 4-inch steam repair clamp is a 2-piece assembly. 2 semicircular steel halves, each with bolt flanges, a high-temperature gasket seated in each half, and 4 assembly bolts. The chief engineer carries the clamp halves. The machinist's mate carries the bolt kit and the torque wrench. The stepladder is positioned under the bracket. The chief engineer climbs to the bracket height. The crack is visible from the ladder. A clean break in the weld bead at the upper face of the bracket, running approximately 6.3 centimeters along the weld line. The adjacent insulation jacket is deformed from the steam jet. The steam exiting the crack has stripped the insulation jacket and partially displaced the fiberglass lagging from the pipe surface for approximately 15 centimeters on either side of the crack. The bare pipe is visible. The pipe surface temperature, measured by touch with the back of the hand through a heavy thermal glove, is approximately 60 degrees Celsius, dropping as the steam inside the header continues to cool with the main supplies shut off. The clamp application requires placing the lower clamp half beneath the pipe, positioning it centered on the crack, holding it in position, placing the upper clamp half over the pipe and aligned with the lower half, and starting the 4 assembly bolts. The lower clamp half must be positioned from below by the machinist's mate. He reaches up from the ladder's lower step while the chief engineer holds the upper half in position. The bolt starting requires 1 person on each side of the pipe. The chief engineer starts the port side bolts from the ladder while the machinist's mate starts the starboard side bolts from the aft side of the bracket, standing on the top step of the step ladder and reaching across the pipe. The ladder is on a deck that is developing frost from the incoming ventilation air. The first bolt is started at 3:28:41 a.m., the second at 3:28:49 a.m. The third, port side, upper bolt, requires a repositioning of the stepladder because the bolt head is partially obscured by the bracket structure. The chief engineer moves the ladder, reclimbs, and starts the third bolt at 3:29:17 a.m. The fourth bolt is started at 3:29:23 a.m. All 4 bolts are snugged by 3:29:45 a.m. The torque sequence begins. The high-temperature gasket in the clamp halves requires 68 Newton-meters of torque, applied in a cross-pattern sequence. The 4 bolts tightened in pairs in alternating sequence to ensure the gasket compresses evenly around the pipe circumference. The torque wrench setting is 68 Newton-meters. The chief engineer applies torque to the port side bolts, while the machinist's mate applies it to the starboard side bolts, working simultaneously. Bolt 1 at 3:29:55 a.m. Bolt 3 at 3:30 and 3 seconds a.m. Bolt 2 at 3:30:11 a.m. Bolt 4 at 3:30:18 a.m. Second pass at 68 Newton meters to confirm full torque. Complete at 3:30:44 a.m. The chief engineer calls DC Central at 3:30:48 a.m. Clamp is on, ready to restore auxiliary steam. Bring pressure up slowly. Watch the space temperature and the pipe pressure gauge at the auxiliary machinery space inlet. If the pressure rises cleanly without space temperature spike, the clamp is holding. DC Central authorizes the boiler room to restore steam at 3:30:53 a.m. The boiler room watch opens the main steam shutoff. Steam pressure in the header begins to rise. At 3:31:11 a.m., the auxiliary machinery space inlet pressure gauge reads 40 pounds per square inch. The space temperature monitor reads 19 degrees Celsius. No spike, no change in trend. At 3:31:27 a.m., the pressure reads 90 pounds per square inch. Space temperature, 18 degrees. At 3:31:44 a.m., the pressure reads 150 psi. Operating pressure. Space temperature, 17 degrees. No steam leak. No pressure drop. The clamp is holding at 150 pounds per square inch. The chief engineer and the machinist's mate descend the ladder and exit the auxiliary machinery space at 3:32:01 a.m. The chief engineer secures the ventilation at 3:32:15 a.m. The Arctic air intake stops. The heating system restoration begins propagating through the ship's forward spaces as the steam pressure is restored to the distribution network. The forward void space temperature, which has dropped from 12 degrees Celsius at 3:23:07 a.m. to 9.8 degrees Celsius at 3:32:15 a.m., a drop of 2.2 degrees in 9 minutes of heating system outage, begins recovering as steam flows back through the distribution piping. The freezing threshold is 4 degrees Celsius. The forward void spaces reached a minimum of 9.8 degrees and are now warming. The margin to freezing was 5.8 degrees. The available time before freezing would have been reached at the 3.5 degrees per hour cooling rate was approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes from the point of steam shutoff. The repair took 9 minutes and 8 seconds from steam shutoff to clamp holding at operating pressure. 1P-800 Oniks intercepted at 29 miles at 3:20:31 a.m. Shockwave arrival at 3:22:49 a.m. Overpressure 0.4 psi. Auxiliary steam header cracket frame 72 bracket weld, 6.3 centimeters at 3:22:49 a.m. Steam jet at 150 pounds per square inch in auxiliary machinery space. Space evacuated by 2 watchstanders in 8 seconds. 1 minor reddening, treated. Main steam shutoff closed at 3:23:07 a.m. Ventilation activated at 3:24:15 a.m. Space enterable at 3:26:30 a.m. at 31 degrees Celsius. Repair team entered at 3:27:14 a.m. 4-inch steam repair clamp applied and torqued at 3:30:44 a.m. Steam restored at 3:30:53 a.m. Clamp confirmed holding at 150 pounds per square inch at 3:31:44 a.m. Total steam system outage, 8 minutes and 37 seconds. Forward void space minimum temperature, 9.8 degrees Celsius. Freezing threshold, 4 degrees. Margin, 5.8 degrees. Time to freezing from minimum, approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes. Ship status operational. The chief engineer was asked at the debrief whether the 90-minute freeze window had influenced his decision to enter the auxiliary machinery space at 3:27 a.m. before it had reached a comfortable working temperature, rather than waiting for full cool down. He said yes. He said the space was at 31 degrees Celsius when they entered, which is uncomfortable but not dangerous for a repair of the duration required. He said, If he had waited for the space to reach 20 degrees, approximately 9 more minutes of ventilation time, the forward void spaces would have been 9 minutes further into their cooling trajectory. 9 minutes at 3.5 degrees per hour is 0.5 degrees. He said 0.5 degrees doesn't sound like much until you remember that the margin was 5.8 degrees, and you are doing subtraction in a space that is trying to freeze your piping. He said he entered at 31 degrees because 31 degrees was good enough. The repair clamp that sealed the frame 72 crack at 150 pounds per square inch in an auxiliary machinery space at 31 degrees Celsius on a February morning in the Bering Sea is still on the pipe. It will be removed when the permanent weld repair is confirmed at Dutch Harbor. The gasket material inside it, rated to 260 degrees Celsius, applied in a 31-degree space by 2 men standing on a ladder that had frost on its deck rails, has not leaked, has not shifted, and has held operating pressure for 22 hours without adjustment. He said he entered at 31 degrees because 31 degrees was good enough. That is the only engineering judgment made in that ladder climb that was not also in the procedure manual. The rest was in the manual. The 9 minutes was in the training. The clamp was in the locker. The arithmetic about the freeze window was in the cold weather operations guide. He brought the arithmetic with him. The 9 minutes came from the training. The clamp came from the locker. The margin of 5.8 degrees was already there, waiting for all three.